Thank you for joining us today on Connect and Collaborate, where we come together each day to introduce you to our network of business and community leaders and to discuss important issues that impact business in Colorado and the region. I'm Tammy Schaefer, your on-air producer, and today we're connecting with Vital for Colorado. Peter Moore, Chairman and CEO of Vital for Colorado, is here with us today. We're so glad to have you back on the show.
Hi, Tammy. How you doing?
Very well.
It's a great show. We always get to talk to interesting people, and our guest today is Stan Dempsey, who's president of the Colorado Mining Association. But Stan has a long background that we'll talk about in terms of other associations, including the Colorado Petroleum Association and what used to be called IPAMS, if I recall correctly, Rocky Mountain Oil and Gas Association, and also Casey, which is one of our board members of the Colorado Association of Commerce and Industry. So welcome, Stan. How you doing?
Thank you very much for having me.
We're glad to have you.
Well, as a real quick advertisement, Vital for Colorado is 501c4. We've been around for, I think this is getting close to our fourth year, and we try to educate and advocate on energy issues, and we try to advocate for responsible energy policy. And we'll talk about that in the context of another industry, because one of our ideas is that we're really all of the above type energy people, and coal and other things that are mined are a very important part of that. So Stan, why don't you tell us about your background and your career, and then we'll get into it.
Well, thank you. I started my career in a strange way, at least in the political or trade association realm. I started with several independent clients. I started off as an independent contract lobbyist, and a couple of lobbyists who had worked with folks that I knew handed some clients off to me that included the Mobile Home Park Owners Association and school psychologists and very disparate groups. That it gave me a wonderful opportunity to learn the General Assembly, the legislative process, and even the regulatory process. I worked for the state of Colorado for 6 months when a program administrator said to me, well, I know you're not doing anything throughout the summer, so come work for me, open the mail. But what he was really providing me was a real good view into the state government and how it worked, as we helped license psychologists and school counselors, and et cetera. And then in 1990, I joined the staff of the Colorado Association of Commerce and Industry. I worked there 8 years, and my primary duty was to cover the various environmental issues. And in the early 90s...
and just as far as the Colorado Association of Commerce and Industry, that's referred to by many people as Casey, and that organization has been a founding member of Vital for Colorado, and many of us think of it as the State Chamber of Commerce really has statewide responsibilities.
Well, I think the role of Casey's very important, and we understand that working for disparate trade associations, because they cover the issues that we don't always want to tackle.
Right.
Sometimes the tough issues or the issues they have particular expertise in. They can collect the collective views of business in Colorado, whether it be small businesses or oil and gas and mining or dry cleaners, and put those policy positions together, and that really is a strong team.
Well, sorry to interrupt and just give a quick ad and promo for our friends at Casey, but they're a very important part of Vital for Colorado, and it's very interesting that you were there. And then what did you do next?
Well, then in 1998, I went to work for the Rocky Mountain Oil and Gas Association, covering Colorado specifically, and that was a time when the industry was in the doldrums. And Ramoga, as it was known, in fact, former Governor Bill Owens had my position maybe 10 years prior in Colorado. But in a difficult time, the states that composed Ramoga wanted to break up, and so we went forward and formed Colorado Petroleum Association. We worked very closely with our friends at COGA and several other trade associations, but the members I represented really wanted its own organization, particularly the large and the major oil companies, and then the refiners wanted to have their own organization, the folks who manufacture gasoline and diesel, because there was no home for them in those organizations. So when we reformed that organization, reincorporated it, built a budget, had a staff, and then formed a new board of directors, So we had to be a little bit entrepreneurial in terms of,
Right.
of doing that. So I was there until just last year.
Very good. And I know about it because I think one of my former law firms, Clanahan, Tanner, Downey, Nelson, was pretty involved in those efforts.
Certainly, and it was. I think partnership was really important. Oil and gas issues have been, front and center for 15 years, whether they be over on the Western Slope or now here on the Metro Front Range, and it's a team effort. And people would say, "Why do you have 2 or 3 trade associations?" Well, all of them have a different membership profile. Sometimes, even within the same industry, you have different points of view, but eventually at the end of the day, you have to come together and pull together and express one industry view.
Well, people know that Colorado started off as a mining state, and Denver and what then was called Aurora was a mining camp. And
Exactly.
many cities and many fortunes existed before, and I guess cities have been lost and fortunes have been lost, but I like the tagline from your website, if it's not grown, it's mined. And that really kind of says the story of Colorado. And I mean, this is a financial center for sure, an insurance center, a legal center, and health center, but it's really agriculture and mining in terms of the 2 strong heritage industries in Colorado.
Well, it really is, and throughout history, Colorado has provided different minerals at different times that have been critical to the United States. First of all, silver and gold, which really brought people to Colorado beginning about 1859, and
Right.
you saw fortunes made in Leadville and Cripple Creek and Black Hawk and Central City. But I would even go back to the 1940s when molybdenum, which is still mined near Leadville and Empire, that was a critical material for the war effort. So,
And just so people know, I guess what are the other major materials that are mined in Colorado? I think of coal and several others.
yeah, we're a major manufacturer of gypsum and sodium bicarbonate, which is used in a lot of different activities, including kitty litter.
Well, mining is still, I think, per your website, $7 million contribution to the GDP of Colorado, 57,000 jobs. And those are direct jobs, right?
Direct jobs, and we're also really another center of international mining. There are many companies who have offices in Denver but have operations worldwide.
Well, thank you, Stan. We'll carry on with the next segment.
Thank you. We'll talk more with Stan Dempsey, president of the Colorado Mining Association, along with Peter Moore, chairman and CEO of Vital for Colorado. Stay with us. Thanks for staying with us here on Connect and Collaborate. We are connecting with Vital for Colorado. Peter Moore, chairman and CEO of Vital for Colorado, is leading our conversation today.
Well, thanks a lot. Our guest today is Stan Dempsey, who's president of the Colorado Mining Association. And as you heard from the last segment, you also have a very long background in terms of oil and gas issues. And start off in the State House as lobbyist, and I think the governmental affairs issues running your family. Your father worked in the mining industry a long time ago, didn't he?
He did. He began his career in Climax, and he came out here to Colorado and worked at Climax. He actually did some work in Boulder County with some of his colleagues, just learning the mining process. But my family lived in Climax actually when there was a town there. My mom taught school, and then moved to Leadville, and then my father held a number of positions with Climax, which became AMAX. There's several successor companies since then. But he handled a lot of the government affairs, the legal department, external affairs, very active in helping build the Henderson mine.
Right.
It was really the first opportunity the mining community had to work with the environmental community, because that mine is very different and built differently than the Climax mine. And there were a lot of, that was the beginning of the environmental movement, and that mine had to be built in the light of a new environmental paradigm.
Well, there are many, it seems that there are many common issues between what currently is going on with the oil and gas industry in Colorado, which from a cynic's point of view, and I suppose I count myself among the cynics, it appears that there are many, many people that just want to keep it in the ground, almost irrespective of the economic realities of the impact on the state, the importance, and most of the policy issues. And these are issues that probably historically also have been dealt with by the mining industry going back to the very first days.
We certainly have had those challenges in the various different communities. On a statewide basis, about 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, we had to litigate against Summit County, who wanted to ban mining that would involve the use of certain chemicals such as cyanide. Now, there weren't those operations in Summit County, but the industry felt it was very important that we push back against that kind of a ban. It's the same kind of concept that's occurring with efforts by communities to ban hydraulic fracturing or severely limit it in the oil and gas context. So some of the litigation that's occurred between local communities and the oil and gas industry, many of the legal tenets are based on the Summit County case, which we litigated about 15 years ago.
And what happened with that case?
We were successful.
So it sounds like it went to the Colorado Supreme Court?
It did.
Okay.
Yes.
And what was that basic ruling? I'm just not familiar with it.
The same concept is that the legislature created, the various regulatory agencies to regulate mining, and the same thing with oil and gas on a statewide basis. There's probably more local control of actual mining operations in practice than there would be with oil and gas, but certainly there have been new partnerships that have been formed for oil and gas in local communities that I was a part of when I was at CPA. So, but there has to be a line, and local communities can't cross that line if they're going to regulate, issues of statewide concern.
Right. Probably about 3 or 4 shows ago, we had a very good guest. He was the public relations, or I guess the community government relations person for the Colorado Department of Natural Resources. Mm-hmm. And he was talking really about the history of Colorado and what the basic mission is of the Department of Natural Resources. And it's balancing 5 basic missions. Mm-hmm. And health, safety, welfare are among those missions, but also protection of private property rights, and also extraction of natural resources, and also use of natural resources for the benefit of the people, and also benefit for the people that own it. And I thought that was very interesting, because people think of governmental control and statewide control and control that might be afforded by a city. And the state has the benefit of having to balance all of those things, and all of the experts, and in the oil and gas industry, petroleum geologists. So to me, it's fairly straightforward. I don't know what expertise a city or a county might have to regulate the mining industry, for example.
Well, they really don't have that expertise.
I mean, they don't have anybody.
Now, in oil and gas, the Oil and Gas Commission has afforded local communities the opportunity to partner with them with regards to identification of potential issues that need to be mitigated, but not to enforce the rules. That's the state's job. In the mining context, you still have some land use issues, and mining companies are going to still have to go through the zoning process, and that's been an issue in a number of different localities. I mean, there was mining aggregate mining in Colorado Springs that was certainly controversial, and it's all been reclaimed. But if you go through along the mountainside of Colorado Springs, you'll see some of the examples of where there was a big dispute between local governments, communities, and mining operations. Now, typically mining operations now are not so close to local communities in which they're going to affect residents, although you may have seen the reference to one of the gold mining shows where the operations have affected new residents in Park County, and that's been a historical mining area.
Sure.
But it's really the state has been acting to enforce its own rules, and there's been a question of whether those rules were being applied by the operator.
I didn't realize that one of the earliest, state preemption cases actually came out of the mining context in Summit County, but it sounds like that's the case.
Absolutely, and it's one that we worked very hard to get industry support for, and it was important to all segments of the industry. The other thing you have to remember is that coal mining is different than hard rock mining, and the issues are different. Just like in oil and gas, your typical upstream production issues are different than the downstream refining issues. So that's one of the things I have to balance within the trade association.
So going from oil and gas to mining, you've held both positions as essentially president or executive director of the trade association. And what differences have you seen?
It was very interesting to move over to the mining context. First of all, oil and gas has just grown so much bigger than mining in terms of production value and taxes paid. We still have a finite number of issues that we deal with. I think oil and gas has got a broader base of issues. I mean, when you're operating adjacent to neighborhoods, it's going to bring a different set of issues than what we have issues with. But we still have activism to attempt efforts by the environmental community on both oil and gas and mining to keep the resource in the ground. So that's a common issue. One of the issues that I see that happens is we're far more active working federal issues than I was at the Petroleum Association, because there were just so many state issues that we didn't really have time to cover those. There were other people who were better able to deal with federal issues.
Right.
So no, it's been a good transition. I've had to learn the names and ranks of all the federal officials, and I didn't have that as much as a responsibility at the state level. But learning the regulatory programs, that was all foreign to me. I didn't have as much experience with the Division of Reclamation, Mining, and Safety, and the coal program, the coal safety program. So those were all new individuals that I have become familiar with.
I used to have a friend that was at State AG's office, and I think the attorneys general called it the Flintstones. That's the phrase they use for it. But it's really interesting, and probably my interaction has to do with gravel mining and things like that,
Sure.
which is all over the place in terms of the metropolitan area. And my observation is that you have a gravel mine, and then it's extracted, then it becomes a lake, and then next thing you know, there are $1 million homes built around it. So sort of the transformation from mining to the gentry is what I've seen in gravel mining.
You raise that. It's a really interesting topic. I live in the Applewood area, and near the Applewood Golf Course, which some developers were planning to buy the land from Coors, develop 400 or 500 homes. And it was pretty controversial in the neighborhood. Maybe not the homes, but all the infrastructure challenges,
sure,
and the schools and traffic. It was actually one of the tactics from our neighborhood group was to use a statute. I think that my father had a hand in writing that said local communities have actually got to determine whether there's resources like gravel and quarry. You had to study that, and you had to identify it, and you can't build homes on top of it. You have to at least consider the fact that it's there.
Right.
And so our attorney for the Homeowners Association was a prominent aggregate attorney who works for a lot of the companies, and was working on behalf of the Homeowners Association to make sure that, in fact, that consideration was being considered, whether you were losing a resource in Colorado that would otherwise be covered up by resident. And that's an interesting side of the fence to be on, but it was, I think, it was a good application of the law, and of course the voters of that community decided to purchase the golf course. But it was one of the tactics used, but it was a very important element in terms of the consideration of the land use.
So you're a local use activist, aren't you?
Well, I wasn't on the board, but it was just, I think it was interesting to see how a law intended to protect minerals was used by a community to say, well, maybe this isn't the right land use.
Well, if you just think about it, the imperative is to consider the development of the minerals as a primary goal. And that's the history of Colorado, and that's the source of that law, I would imagine.
It really is. And because, as Colorado was growing quickly in the 70s, that was a major concern.
Well, it's very interesting, and I think, I don't know if golf courses are better than gravel mines, but I guess so.
Well, I think that there was an opportunity for the voters the open space folks to purchase that property. So I think it all turned out pretty well.
Yeah, it did.
Thank you. We're talking with Stan Dempsey, President of the Colorado Mining Association, along with Peter Moore, Chairman and CEO of Vital for Colorado. We will have much more coming up with Vital for Colorado as we come back after this break.
I think we'll talk about the Clean Power Act, and hopefully Stan can explain it to me as it was under the previous administration, what might happen in the future.
Perfect. We'll be back with more. Stay right here. We're happy to have Chairman and CEO of Vital for Colorado, Peter Moore, here, along with Stan Stan Dempsey, president of the Colorado Mining Association.
Stan, welcome very much. I think we want to talk about the Clean Power Plan, and I see that you recently wrote an op-ed piece on this topic. Before we get into the opinion part of that op-ed, why don't you just tell us what the Clean Power Plan is, and why it was developed, and what it was trying to address?
Certainly, and thank you. Clean Power Plan was a major environmental initiative from the Obama administration. A little bit of history, Congress had failed to pass legislation, Waxman Markey legislation. Congress also refused to ratify the Kyoto Agreement. And so President Obama, like on many other topics, said, well, you know what? I don't need Congress to act. And with the Supreme Court's endangerment findings saying that carbon had to be dealt with one way or the other, and that it was something that was endangering people in terms of the overall environmental programs, President Obama rolled out the Clean Power Plan, and its goal was simply to reduce CO2 emissions from from all electric utilities by about 30% by 2030. And so it kicked off a series of actions for states to identify which electric generating units were going to be either converted, closed, or retrofitted with renewables.
And this plan was enacted by executive order?
Yes.
And not by action of Congress?
Well, it was actually executed through the auspices of EPA under the Clean Air Act, when they used, I think it was Section 111,
right,
which is a narrowly tailored provision of the act, and this was a major policy change. This was changing the overall electric grid in the United States, taking something that big and putting it in a very, using a very narrow section of the Clean Air Act to justify it legally.
Do you have an opinion as to whether President Obama had that right and power?
I think it's the Supreme Court and the Court of Appeals that have questioned and were on the cusp of taking that apart legally, that concept. And of course, Justice Scalia's untimely death that may or may not have had an effect on whether that was what way the court was going to rule on that. But I think many legal experts and ones that you wouldn't think of have expressed grave concern and doubt whether the rule would have survived.
And what problems during the period of time that it was being implemented? Because I think it was implemented for more than 4 or 5 years, wasn't it?
Well, it was just beginning to be implemented.
It was just beginning?
But
okay,
in Colorado, no matter what industry organization you were a part of, and I remember going to some of the first meetings that the health department sponsored to get feedback and, what's the planning process going to look like. One of the problems for Colorado, and I think the governor expressed concern about, was that emission reductions that occurred before 2012 or were in the process, particularly through Clean Air, Clean Jobs, weren't going to be counted. And those were emission reductions that came at a very high cost, not only in terms of coal production, but jobs, but certainly a major expense to ratepayers. And that was one of the troubling points to the Clean Power Plan for Colorado policymakers.
And I think I know what you're talking about, but that was the conversion of the Cherokee power plant from coal to natural gas.
Which are significant emission reductions, no matter how you feel about that. Emission reductions, in terms of criteria pollutants, but a major source of reductions for CO2.
And no credit for all that time and expense, right, and all the improvement that was created by that.
That's right. And so that was one of the problems for Colorado. Of course, every state would line up a little bit differently under that scenario.
So the starting point was 2012, and what happened before 2012 didn't count?
Well, I think what happened, I think that regulators, planners, utility executives were really struggling to figure out, there were different options that states could take. You could take one option here or one option there. What option works best for your state? And I think they were still in that decision-making process to try to figure out what path to go.
So there's a new administration and new ideas about the Clean Power Plan. Could you summarize your understanding of those?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think the Trump administration had very different views about resources developed in the United States, whether they be coal, oil and gas, or renewable, that this country was going to become energy dominant, and we're going to use all our resources. And the Clean Power Plan was just one of those regulatory initiatives that the Trump administration said, hey, we're going to take a time out, we're going to review it, and we're going to make a recommendation. And that's what they did. And I think based on the poor legal reasoning behind the rule, and I think the practicality that it was going to have a dramatic impact not only on the electric grid system in the United States, which was one of the criticisms of the plan in the first place, but the impact on coal and coal production throughout the country. I think they said, because of this poor legal reasoning, we need to rethink this, and they proposed to repeal it.
And also the impact on ratepayers in particular. Absolutely.
If you're gonna lose coal as your fundamental baseload power source for our economy, was that really truly taken into consideration? And like you, we support a mixture of resources to be used to generate electricity and net, and for heating our homes. If you're going to lose, in Colorado, we're still at 55% baseload power. Now, we acknowledge that Excel thinks that's going to be a little bit less in the future, but still, losing 55% of your baseload electricity generated from coal, that's going to be a major impact on the grid. It's going to hurt our economy.
And to get a sense of, I guess, the time period to get from one type of energy to another type of energy, it's been decades. And I think that the baseload has been above 50% forever.
It really has been. In fact, I think it was just a few years ago, it was 60%. And
right.
So, we've had, obviously, Clean Air, Clean Jobs has taken 1,000 megawatts of coal-fired electricity out of the system. But, and we've certainly seen, some mines close because of that. But, but 55% is still a number that we really have to consider, whether we want to lose that or not.
If you were the boss and you had a right to enact, I guess, our regulatory policy for emissions, what are better ways to achieve lower emissions over time?
I think that's a great question, and I think I would start off with a national conversation about how we want our electric grid to look like, and what policies do we want Congress to enact. Let's start with Congress first and foremost, because they made a very powerful statement in the previous two actions I mentioned, which was the rejection of Waxman-Markey, which was a trading system, and they rejected the climate agreements and from the past. So I think Congress still needs to have that discussion, and there's going to be differences among different states. I also think that we need to invest in carbon sequestration and new technologies to make coal sustainable over the long term, to make sure that it's a part of our energy base, because not only is it a great fuel for that baseload power, but it employs so many people throughout the country.
And what technologies are available to have clean coal?
Well, I think we're really excited about carbon capture and sequestration. It was an initiative that we looked at, back in 2010, following Clean Air, Clean Jobs. The Department of Natural Resources had a work group on defining the regulatory structure of how we would sequester and store carbon underground. We use it in oil and gas as tertiary recovery, to use carbon as a way to carbon dioxide to enhance oil field production. So I think that's one of the solutions. There's a lot of research being done. I think that investment by the federal government is important, that we use all our natural resources.
I think there was a meeting, and you probably know more about this than I do. It's just casual reading. I was on Germany just a few days ago, or during the last week. I think that President Trump's administration tried to talk about coal, and activists literally in the meeting shouted them out and would not allow them to be heard. That's what I got from the story.
Well, I hadn't heard that, but I'm not surprised, because I just bring that story home to Colorado. Any effort to modify the lease or to expand a mine, to keep 200 people working in the North Fork Valley, every action that's taken by the federal government to facilitate that's litigated.
We're talking with Stan Dempsey, president of the Colorado Mining Association, along with Peter Moore, chairman and CEO of Vital for Colorado. We will be back with more. Stay with us right after this break. We're so glad you're staying with us today here on Connect and Collaborate. We are connecting with Peter Moore, chairman and CEO of Vital for Colorado. Peter, we're so glad to have you back on the show.
Well, thanks a lot. For those who want to know a little bit more about Vital for Colorado, our website's a good place to go to. It's www, the words Vital for Colorado spelled out, .com. We currently have a coalition of about 74,000 Colorado citizens, 1,000 businesses. We're run by 15-person member board of directors, many private businesses, but also many chambers of commerce and trade associations. And today we're talking about mining with Stan Dempsey as president of the Colorado Mining Association. And just to sort of follow up on a theme from our last segment, in today's world, there's a new phrase that people want to protest by direct action. And in my mind, it's direct action means outside the public process, outside seeking permits from the county or trying to negotiate a memorandum of understanding or trying to get a permit from the state agency, but rather to directly protest and try to gum up the works. And I've read in some pieces that the people that are doing this think that it's they're right. It's not violence. It's self-defense. It's self-defense against the community ideals that they think are so important and are predominant. I think the mining industry is a little bit farther away from population centers than the oil and gas industry. But can you think of examples where the mining industry has had a taste of this kind of direct action in the past, or does the distance create a barrier for you?
I think in Colorado, perhaps we go back 30, 40 years ago. I think that, I don't think activists were, threatening violence or direct action. I think that, say, Crested Butte, which has had the potential for a large molybdenum mine, on the Red Lady Mountain.
Right.
That was the center of intense community opposition, particularly in the town of Crested Butte, but there was support for the industry in the rest of Gunnison County. I think that the community mobilized very strongly and felt very protective of the Red Lady Mountain. Save our Red Lady was the theme. So that's an example going back to the early 80s and then throughout
was that effort successful? Did the mine open?
Well, I think the mine would have opened. I think the permitting was successful when AMAX was working on it. Then the molybdenum market collapsed completely. So, also economics has something to do with that.
Sure.
And then efforts to resuscitate that mine, those opportunities have fallen short. And now Freeport-McMoran, which is the successor company to AMAX, has actually worked with the community to address long-term water treatment issues up there. Because there's been mining up there in the past, and perhaps sell the mining claims. So that's had a long and checkered history, but that's where we saw mining activism concerned about mining, directly, pretty near a community that we experienced.
So what's the best way to try to counter that kind of sentiment? I think sometimes the approach of Vital for Colorado, which is try to calmly and rationally explain our principles and try to explain the facts and try to explain the strength of the regulatory system, try to explain the economic impact and the severance tax and the benefit to the local community, doesn't seem to resonate well with those that are zealots, perhaps, and just say, at any cost, keep it in the ground.
I don't think you'll ever be able to rationalize with the zealots, and I felt that way in oil and gas, and I feel that way with folks, say Wild Earth Guardians, who frequently litigate every single action of the federal government in terms of, particularly in coal, where it's not because the coal mine is located adjacent to a community, it's because they want to end the practice of using coal as a source for electricity. So
how do you stop 55% of the baseload tomorrow? Like, how's that done?
Well, they don't have to provide that answer. They can quickly say, let's go as fast as we can towards renewables. They believe certain gubernatorial candidates who promised them that we'll get to renewables by 2040. But in our case, it's a matter of they're using the legal process, the NEPA process, and they're using things like trying to calculate the social cost of carbon. We're not going to be able to rationalize with those folks. I think it's like Vital's effort to reach out to the folks who are in the middle, or folks who may have indicated some concerns about impacts in their local communities, and then trying to talk about what that regulatory process is, what opportunities exist for citizens to become involved. The governor showed a lot of leadership in forming, reintroducing the North Fork Valley Working Group to deal with the question of whether we could capture methane that's emitted from the West Elk mine and convert it into some useful product, as they are in some cases with the support of Aspen Skiing Company at the mine across the street, the Elk Creek mine, which is now closed, but they're capturing methane and it's being used as a way to generate some electricity for the Aspen Skiing Company.
Sometimes the effort, though, to try to, address the rational middle doesn't move because the middle shifts. And I'm thinking about a very, very recent election. I think it was just last week in Broomfield. And this is getting back to your Summit County case. And in Broomfield, there's a resolution called 301 that gives the city plenary power, which is superior power, for the granting of oil and gas permits, and it's superior to that of the state. Many people, and I guess including myself, believe that that's directly against Colorado Supreme Court cases. And the city attorney for Broomfield also shares that opinion. He said before the election, don't pass this resolution. It's not legal. There will be litigation, and the city will lose and will have to pay for no particularly good reason. And yet, that initiative won, I think, something like 57%. How do you account for that? It's, to me, very puzzling and actually kind of troubling that people would ignore the advice of their own city attorney, who had spent 5 years, by the way, trying to defend the city of Broomfield. So this very learned man. And he knew because he had not been successful. I think in the paper he said he only had 2 or 3 weekends off in 3 or 4 years because of litigation he had to be involved in.
Well, I think we can't discount the existence and contribution that was made by outside groups, the Tom Steyer groups of the world, that who have lots of money to spend. And their new tactic is to get very involved in local elections. And my suspicion is, though I wasn't involved in the campaign, is that probably saw a lot of outside money flow in, either reported or unreported. It can be in the form of just providing volunteers. It can be providing infrastructure support. So I see a lot of big money coming into a lot of these local races that and I think it's people are voting on emotion in a lot of cases like that. And so I think the opposition has refined its message. They've seemed to have found some kind of a message that's worked, that the industry is going to have to deal with.
Yeah, it's very, very troubling. That's probably the one that I can think of that's very, very recent. We're just talking to people about the facts. Doesn't seem to work.
Well, and it's also interesting. I mean, I said the industry. Maybe it's the local governments are going to have to think through, how they communicate with their citizens, and do people have trust in what their local governments are telling them? That may be a question they're going to have to ask themselves too.
Well, let's go back to your organization, the Colorado Mining Association. We're in 2017. I guess, what are the biggest issues that now face your trade group, and what can you expect for the future?
Well, the opportunity we have is in April we put on our 120th National Western Mining Conference and exhibit. So this is my first conference that we plan all by ourselves and put a program together, and we've come up with a conference theme: Mining is the Future, Today, Tomorrow, and Beyond. And we're really going to be talking about sustainability of the industry, not only in Colorado but around the world, in terms of what are the challenges that mining companies are experiencing, such as who to hire and how to maximize the benefit of a mining employment? How do we account for diversity and opportunities for different kinds of people to work in mining throughout the world? And then, once again, the relationship with local governments and promoting how companies are partnering with local governments, and also the use of technology. So we have an exciting conference coming up. We hope to have some key figures from the administration speak. Then, of course, we have the run-of-the-mill typical environmental program challenges. We're going to see some legislation, telling the state DNR how to permit mines, and we'll have to oppose that. We'll probably see lots of carbon legislation. It is an election year. People are going to posture themselves.
Thank you very much, Stan Dempsey, Colorado Mining Association.
You can find out more at coloradomining.org.